Welcome to the Outrage Science Bites podcast, a companion podcast to the Outrage Overload podcast. This is day 16 of the NaPodPoMo challenge. That's National Podcast Post Month. That's a 30-day challenge to produce 30 podcast episodes in the month of November. And this is day 16, so we're on the downhill side. So we're going to come back with another cognitive bias, and we'll get through this one, I think, pretty quickly. This one's known as worst case scenario thinking. And this is the tendency to focus on the most negative and improbable outcomes, often fueled by fear and anxiety. So I guess one example of that might be, let's say that the conviction that the other side is controlled by foreign powers or some evil forces. And then that belief is often based on conspiracy theories and misinformation, can lead people to distrust the government, the media, and even their own neighbors. A lot of stuff we talk about on this podcast as well as on the Outrage Overload podcast. And that's how we end up, that can drive and fuel political polarization and other negative effects. It can fuel political polarization and more of that us versus them mentality that we talk about that often gets in the way of constructive dialogue and compromise. It can also lead to the spread of misinformation and fear-mongering as individuals selectively share and believe information that reinforces their worst fears. So again, it can undermine trust in institutions, exacerbate social divisions, and hinder pursuit of common ground. And it can also lead to impulsive and irresponsible decisions as we act out of fear rather than reason. So for this one to kind of reverse the process, we need to cultivate a culture of rational thinking and emotional awareness. And that involves recognizing our tendency to catastrophize, questioning the validity of our negative thoughts, and seeking out more balanced perspectives. We must also develop strategies to maintain our emotions, such as mindfulness and relaxation techniques, to prevent fear and anxiety from clouding our judgment. And in addition to those individual things, we need to promote a more civil and respectful political discourse. We talk about this a lot on this podcast and the Outrage Overload podcast. And this means holding politicians and pundits accountable for their rhetoric, avoiding inflammatory language, and encouraging open-minded dialogue. And, of course, we also need to foster a society that values critical thinking and evidence-based decision-making. Now, in our politics, this is a big problem because, worst-case scenario thinking is a great tool. If you can get people afraid of some major thing, then this can have a huge impact to their actions. That fear will obviously often lead to have them vote the way you want or donate money, or watch television shows that they want you to watch. And so this is a really common thing, and it's really easy to go down this slippery slope where the line between, a realistic fear or outcome, in other words, probability is reasonable, and one that's sort of unreasonable. And drawing that line gets harder and harder as the extremes get further and further, and the extreme voices get louder and louder. So making that distinction can be difficult in some cases. But it requires really more of that critical thinking, trying to stay less emotional about it, and asking yourself, how realistic is this worst case scenario really? And am I just blowing the thing up to be bigger than it really is? So that's all in this episode of Outrage Science Bites. If you like these little episodes, you may like the long-form Outrage Overload podcast. That's at outrageoverload.net. We just put out a episode just especially for Thanksgiving holidays and all the conversations that are the inevitable conversations that go with it. That episode is with David McCraney, and that's up at Outrage Overload now. Episode 26, I believe. So check that out at outrageoverload.net, where you can subscribe there. You can also scroll down and find access to more episodes, past episodes, all the episodes of the of this Outrage Science Bites podcast. So you can scroll down at outrageoverload.net and find that at the bottom. And I'd also ask you to, at the bottom of that website is also a place where you can submit a voice message. If you'd like to have your voice heard, or you drop me a little note, you can do that right there from your web browser and send me a note. You can also always email me, outrageoverload@gmail.com. So thanks for listening, and watch for another episode tomorrow.